Great, thank you so much, and thank you, Jayati, for really organizing this amazing conference. The first panel I really enjoyed it, and I'm not closer to me, okay. And then also, and thank you for having me here. So I'm going to, this is the cover of the Financing for Sustainable Development report as it just came out. I felt like I had to show it to you. It covers all the areas of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, so all of the different areas of financing for sustainable development, from public finance, tax issues, private finance, development cooperation, debt, systemic issues, and trade and technology. But this report, just to say, and I may make some comments about this later, is actually written with 60 UN agencies. So Richard, in his former role in UNCTAD, was part of this process, but it also includes the IMF and the World Bank. And so on all of the different issues, such as debt, et cetera, systemic issues, there are always really big differences amongst the task force, and what comes out is where the task force can best agree on issues. And so sometimes the most interesting part of this process is not the report itself, but what happens behind the scenes in the discussions, and maybe I'll mention some of those. So just to start with the reason that the first bullet is there, that this is a sustainable development crisis, is because, as many of you know, the IMF has been saying that it's not a debt crisis, because it's not a systemic debt crisis, because it's not a financial debt crisis. And so we had to come to an agreement as to where we could come together to say what kind of debt crisis do we really have. And this was sort of that it's a sustainable development debt crisis. The report also highlights that there SDG and that there are enormous financing gaps. So the number of 2 trillion or so that was before the financial crisis has now been raised to between 3 and 5 trillion before the COVID crisis has now been raised. But the other really big issue, of course, is the finance divide, that developing countries pay much more for their debt than developed countries, and that the countries that need the money the most to invest, so the best way to get out of a debt crisis is to invest, and the countries that need to be able to invest to get out of a debt crisis can't borrow at affordable terms, and so are in a negative loop. And so that's one of the big issues that I'll come to later in terms of thinking about debt, not just as the question, and I think Danny mentioned this as well, it's no longer just thinking about the debt restructuring architecture, it's also thinking about the architecture for addressing countries that can't invest can't spend money on social services and also can't invest in development. The second 2 points, and this is in all the discussions in the UN, and particularly in the financing for development discussions, are questions on the national level of how do countries better align their own policies to support sustainable development, and then, of course, international financial architecture issues. And I put this all there because the conclusion, of course, is that the financing challenges are at the heart of the crisis, but you also need, financing also holds the key to change. But the main point is really that their conclusion across the board, and this was something that we couldn't get, I think, in 2019 or it was very hard to get all of our partners to agree that the financial architecture was not fit for purpose. And now all of the partners, including the fund and the bank and everyone else, agrees that there has to be a fundamental shift in the financial architecture. And so the member states at the UN mandated there will be a conference, I think most of you know about this, in Spain in 2025, which Financing for Development, the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, which will follow up on the Monterey Consensus and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda to update and both the financing framework for sustainable development as well as governments' commitments to what they would do to implement sustainable development. But the really interesting thing this time around is that the governments in the UN, all member states unanimously agree that this conference has to focus on the international financial architecture. So, and then if you go back to the first conference of this type in Monterey, the Monterey Consensus in 2002, after it was agreed on, the Bush administration in the US published it on their website. They were part of the agreement, and Bush was actually at the conference, but they left off the chapter on systemic issues that it deals with international financial architecture because they didn't want those issues being discussed in the UN. And now, for the first time, there is an agreement that not only is it there, but that the conference should actually has to focus on these issues. So that does bring me to the question, though, that really follows up from Danny's presentation just a little while ago, where he mentioned that that we shouldn't have hope in multilateralism and in international cooperation. And I think Danny hit on the most important, in which case then I can just go home and not have the conference next year because there's no point to it, and which I certainly want to hope that there is a point to it. But I think Danny's other comment was that to really understand that countries will act in their own self-interest, and so yes, you will only have changes to the financial architecture when it is in the more powerful country's interest to do that. And I think that right now, there is certainly a lot of pressure on them and a lot of issues that is making this in their self-interest. And I think the goal of the discussions that we're having is how to convince them that this is in their self-interest and to align the incentives across the board. And the first pressure point, I think, was clearly climate. So the fact that there's a global public good, a global crisis that really needs global coordination to solve is one of the reasons that you see that many of the developed countries began to think more about rebuilding the development bank system, for example. The main push behind that is clearly to finance climate issues. The second point, though, are the geopolitical issues that were being discussed earlier. So there is, I think, and you really see what I'm about to say in the differences in discussions between in Washington, D.C. on these issues and in the UN. Because the UN has foreign affairs ministries, so we have the political side of governments there. Whereas in DC, you have the finance ministries. And these economic issues have become so political and are really driven, in many cases for the North, by this fear of the divided world that was just being discussed. And so this power that developing countries may have and how they may use that. And it's not just middle-income countries, because we saw in the discussions that we're having on tax in the UN right now, where the Africa groups came together, and this may be the start of a stronger negotiating bloc in the UN from the Africa group itself, within the G77, but also in its own, that they came together and pushed forward discussions, negotiations on a framework convention for tax at the UN, where there was enormous opposition from developed countries and from the OECD in particular. And yet the African group pushed it forward, and there was a vote that was just North versus South. That was only in December. By February, the political implications of that very divisive vote became very clear to countries in the North. And by the first meeting in February for the organizational session of this committee to negotiate the terms of reference for the Framework Convention, there was not a single country that said it shouldn't be happening. So it's happening this week, actually. The discussions are going, and the U.S. Treasury is in the room, which, in December would have been almost an impossibility. So it was clear that this idea that the risks of allowing this divisive, divided world politically and probably and thus financially in the medium term for the North are really noticeable. They're more discussed and felt in the UN, which is why you see the UN, I think, pushing forward on so many issues, and you see differences between the finance ministry people and the foreign affairs ministry people within the same countries, both on tax as well as on some of the international financial architecture issues. And so part of the goal of the conference in 2025 is to bring these two sides together that it's no longer when we have discussions, and we've been having a series of discussions between the ambassadors in New York and the executive directors in DC, but it's no longer just the executive director saying, this is what, we'll answer your questions and tell you what we're doing. It's now more of a conversation saying, these are the issues and how we see it from this side, and you have to listen to this side as well. So just to say that that's a little bit where these discussions are right now. So I'm going to go through this. I only have 5 minutes left, and yeah, okay, but I'll go through this really quickly. This was just the beginning of how do we get here and looking at some of the long-term trends. And as you can see, the growth, average global growth fell from 6.3% in the early 2000s to on an average to much lower levels since then. I think the story behind that is the story Danny told this morning. So, and then the second piece of this is that why there's so much focus on the investment side is you can see that as global growth in the slide, if you can see that that the green line, which is investment, is trailing global growth issues. So the underscoring for the real importance of a big investment push in sustainable development and both to stimulate growth and to address the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the reason behind the Secretary General's call for an SDG stimulus as well. And then, of course, you all know this. Sorry, the caption fell off. The blue line is the mean and the orange line is the median. But just to say, just again, this is getting back to the debt question of the cost of debt service, which rose by basically 4 times from 2010 to 2023. And again, this gets back to the question of, are we in a debt crisis or not? Clearly, we're in a debt crisis for the countries who are spending such a big portion of their budgets on financing debt and unable to invest in other, in sustainable development goals and growth, and as well as in social issues. So in this, of course, are these numbers that have been shared quite often about how these countries are spending more on debt servicing than on health, education, and investment. And so I'm going to be shorter than the time, but just to say that, so as we're talking about and preparing for the conference that's going to happen in 2025 and thinking about what can actually be accomplished. We're looking at each of the different issues and in each of the chapters and are having work streams that quite some of you are actually involved in on each of the different areas that are being covered. And in the area of debt, as this is the topic of the conference, it's the first thought, and I think this came out earlier today as well, is really reframing the narrative on debt so that we don't want to just talk about the debt resolution architecture, though that's critically important. We also want to talk about this challenge of addressing the fact that countries, of the finance divide, that countries don't have access to affordable financing to invest in sustainable development. Some countries, it's a pure liquidity issue. Other countries, it's I don't know if it's liquidity or not. It's the markets think that they have bad credit, whatever you want to call that. But either way, there's a gap in the architecture there because we have the global financial safety net through the IMF is based on balance of payments issues. And there's no structure in the system that can really help countries that have a fiscal crisis. And which is one reason why there are, of course, ideological reasons, but also sometimes when the IMF goes and says, okay, we're not going to push austerity anymore, and they come back pushing austerity, one of the issues is that there aren't other tools to help those countries. And so one of the questions that we want to address for the conference is we want to keep the questions of sovereign debt restructuring, the bigger questions of mechanisms and architecture on the table, though we know they will not be solved by 2025. And also, just getting something into a document doesn't solve it. So in the Monterey Consensus, there was an agreement, a call for a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. Around a month later and that was when the IMF under Ann Kruger was pushing for an SDRM. A month later, John Taylor in the US killed the idea. And so you have it in a UN document and nobody cares. So we want to make sure that we have ideas that are here that can actually be implemented. So one of the thoughts is, how do we create an environment where we keep the debates and discussion on the bigger architectural issues alive, even if we can't solve them next year. And so one issue that's already in the outcome document for the Summit of the Future is to have a review of the sovereign debt architecture to continue that discussion in a more systematic and within the UN system formal way. And the second is to look through within the existing mechanisms we have, are there short-term solutions we can do to address these 3 different types of problems within the debt architecture. And so finally, I just listed each of these financing for development discussions is always a deal between countries. The original Monterey Consensus said countries are responsible for their own development and the international community is responsible for an enabling international environment and support. But this is focused on the IFA issues, even though the domestic issues will probably be part of the discussion as well. But so some of the questions that we put down, and I just listed those bullets there that are being highlighted as issues to discuss are there. Those very difficult issues of voice. Can it be moved forward in any way? The tax architecture, which, as I said, is very linked to the discussions happening in this new committee that's right now as we speak, this very minute, negotiating what the terms of reference for a framework convention would look like, investment and trade rules, reforms to the development bank system, development-friendly reform debt architecture that goes beyond, again, beyond just the debt restructuring issues, but also looks at these other issues. And I'll say one last piece on that, because when we talk to our colleagues in the in the World Bank, they say, well, we do net new financing, and that's exactly what countries need. But it is, in many cases, that's great, and it's good to have net new financing, especially below market rates. But when a country is very heavily indebted, then there are, even if they're not about to restructure, they're not going to default, there still needs to be a way to reduce the debt stock, because without reducing the debt stock, the cost of borrowing for the private sector stays really high. And if the way for countries to grow is domestic activity, even if we don't know exactly what that looks like these days, but if the way to grow, then you have to bring the cost of borrowing in the country down as well. And so, yes, we can think about the National Development Bank system. We're working very closely with Finance and Commons Summit to work with national development banks for the conference as well. But also, there have to be mechanisms to help countries actually reduce the debt stock. And that has to be that's one of the issues of thinking about how do we close that gap. And then finally, strengthening the global financial safety net. And then the second issue that I know we will not be able to answer is the question of formulating what do these new development pathways look like. I don't know what an international agreement could help that, but it's definitely one of the questions that our countries from the South wanted us to put on the agenda. And finally, this question of dealing with the credibility gaps and trying to rebuild trust in multilateralism, and can the conference itself and the tax negotiations be a step to actually help do that. So thanks so much.